Drug abuse in the United States has been getting continually worse over about the past half century. The United States National Library of Medicine states that as of now, 114 million people in the United States over the age of just 12 have used drugs. Though marijuana is the most popular of these drugs, we're seeing huge spikes in other much more dangerous categories. This chart from drugabuse.gov shows deaths caused by heroin overdose from 1999 to 2015. You can read that number there. In 2015, the amount of deaths was over 6 times what it was just 16 years prior. It's very easy to say that our drug policies are not working. Our modern narcotics policies have not changed in a long time. They can actually be traced back to the Nixon administration. In his 1970 campaign, Richard Nixon proposed the war on drugs, a way to fight public enemy number one. It was revolutionary, promised harsh crackdowns and things like mandatory minimums and zero-tolerance policies across the board. For the voters, it was a no-brainer. It killed 2 birds with 1 stone. It not only got criminals off the streets, but got drugs away from the kids. But once you do even the slightest amount of digging, you find that their motives might not have been so pure. That man right there is John Ehrlichman. He was one of the top advisors to Richard Nixon, both during his campaign and then during his presidency. In a 1994 interview, he was quoted as saying the following: "The Nixon White House had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." This isn't conspiracy theory stuff. This is real. And to put it simply, the war on drugs was a colossal failure. It created the system that we know today that is full of mass incarceration and not only more prevalent drugs, but also more powerful drugs and cheaper ones. So the question comes up, how do we tackle drug use in America? I think first we need to understand a little bit more about addiction and how addiction works. Our traditional assumptions about addiction largely come from experiments that were carried out a lot in the early 20th century. The experiment kind of goes as follows. A rat is placed into a cage and given 2 water bottles, one of which is spiked with either cocaine or heroin or some other powerful drug. Every time the researchers saw the rats go towards that drug bottle, and once they used it once, they would use it until they eventually overdosed and died. And it's hard to state how powerful these experiments were, because it gave us, as a culture, our assumptions about drug use. The first assumption that it gave us is that drugs are dangerous, and drug use will eventually lead to an early death. And the second and most important is that drugs are addictive. And if you use drugs, you will inevitably become addicted. But these things have been so pounded into our heads over the past 70 years. Many of you may remember commercials like these when you were a kid. Speakers coming to your schools and talking about the dangers of drugs and how addictive they are. They were in our TV shows, and they were in the TV shows of our parents, on the commercials. They're everywhere. But what if I told you that the experts in the field of drug addiction disagreed? This is because in the 1960s, a man named Dr. Bruce Alexander and his team looked at that classic experiment and thought, if the rat is supposed to represent a person, then the cage should represent his surroundings. And it didn't. He compared it to testing these drugs on prisoners in solitary confinement, who would, without a doubt, use these drugs if given them. So he thought, let's reimagine the cage. So he created something called Rat Park. This is a cartoon, but it's fairly accurate. Rat Park was pretty much heaven for rats. It had plenty of wide open space, cans for them to hide in, wheels for them to exercise in, other rats for them to have sex with. it was great. But most importantly in that cage was the 2 water bottles. And just like the researchers in the early experiments, Dr. Alexander was not surprised by his findings. He found that the rats hardly ever touched the drug water, and when they did, they never did so compulsively, and they saw 0 overdoses. So the question comes back. How do we modify our cage? It's a tough question, because we have a more complex society than rats, hopefully. But luckily, we have an example. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized all drugs, from weed to heroin. They did so because, at the time, they had the most deadly drug problem in the world. Before they did this, they found that 1% of their population was addicted to illicit drugs. So the government gathered a panel of experts in the field of both addiction and drug use, and then they just kind of took the leap. They knew they had to do something drastic to combat this problem. They had tried the old ways. They had tried the strict policies, and it just wasn't working. And that was 17 years ago, and the results are in. As you can see right there, Portugal is somewhere near or at the bottom. This is a report done by the New York Times, and it is drug overdoses in populations per million. And you can see, obviously, the United States is at the top, and it's pretty high. So, back to that question. What can we do? Well, if we look towards Portugal, we see what they do. When you get caught with drugs in Portugal, you don't go to jail. You go to a doctor. Because there, it's not a criminal problem, it's a public health issue. So you go to a doctor, and if they determine that your drug addiction or your drug abuse is more than just recreational, then you get treatment. And afterwards, it's not hard for you to get a job, because the government helps you get a job there. And instead of being barred from society, you're actually injected back into society, forced into that cage instead of in seclusion. And I'll be the first to say it, that we're not Portugal. We're different places with different cultures and a different society, but the goal is the same for both of us. And if we want to tackle drug use in America, then we need to take some steps in the positive direction, because we've been going the wrong way for far too long.